Então, agora a gente vai começar a palestra com a doutora Lynn Bird, que é geneticista pediátrica da Clínica Angelman, do Hospital Rady Children's de San Diego. E ela é a investigadora principal da Clínica Angelman de San Diego. E a doutora Adriana Gomes, que é a diretora do nosso comitê científico e é co-investigadora junto com a doutora Lynn Bird. Thank you, Dr. Bird. Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for being here today with us. Eu vou só complementando. A palestra vai ser em inglês, porque a doutora Bird estava esperando um update de uma das farmacêuticas, mas ela depois vai ser legendada e vai legendada para o nosso YouTube. Tá? Então, a gente ia ter feito uma palestra pré-gravada e, por conta dessa resposta dessa farmacêutica, a gente optou por fazer já com a resposta da farmacêutica em inglês, mas a doutora Adriana, no final, pode responder as perguntas em português. Tá? Welcome, Dr. Bird, Dr. Gomez. Thank you so much for being with us here today on a Saturday. And I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for inviting us to talk to you today. I'm sure Carol introduced not only myself, but also Adriana Gomez, who's going to be part of our discussion today. And we've been asked to update you in research and clinical trials. Before we start, I just want to review what I hope that we're going to cover today. So for any of you who are relatively new to the Angelman world, we're going to talk a little bit about Angelman syndrome and review the 4 molecular subtypes of Angelman syndrome. And I'm going to try to explain the concept of imprinting and the mechanism by which the paternal copy of UBE3A is silenced. And then we're going to talk about the ongoing clinical trials for Angelman syndrome. Here are my disclosures. I'm a paid consultant for Ionis Pharmaceuticals in developing their Angelman program, and I've also run clinical trials for Angelman syndrome for a variety of different companies. So, Angelman syndrome, of course, is named after Harry Angelman, who getting very close to 60 years ago now, described 3 children who had absent speech, very happy personalities, and tended to have an unusual way of walking with their hands upheld to give them balance. And he called them puppet children because the way they held their hands reminded him of puppet hands on a string. We now, of course, call this condition Angelman syndrome. And before we had the ability to diagnose Angelman syndrome in the laboratory, we made it as a clinical diagnosis. And so the features that we saw in nearly everybody with Angelman syndrome was severe delays in development that evolved into intellectual disability. No speech in most patients. Occasionally there might be a single word. Movement disorder that included difficulties with balance, which we call ataxia, and tremors or a fine shaking of the hands usually. The behavior was pretty characteristic. Happy personalities, frequent smiling, very excitable, and laughter that was easily provoked. And those were seen in virtually everybody. And then in a large percentage of patients, we saw microcephaly or small head that usually evolved by 2 years of age or so. Seizures or epilepsy that often started before the age of 3 years. And if we did an EEG to look at the brain waves, the electrical signal there, we would see some abnormalities that were very characteristic for Angelman syndrome, high voltage spike waves, and what we call an increased amount of delta, which is the 2 to 3 cycles per second wave. And then occasionally we saw feeding problems, gastroesophageal reflux, excessive mouthing behaviors and drooling, prognathism, which is a jutting of the lower jaw, which was usually something not seen until adolescents or adults, a broad mouth with widely spaced teeth, strabismus or eye crossing, being hypopigmented, in other words, having a hair, eye, and skin color that was lighter than expected for the family, disturbances in sleep, and fascination with water. And now that we've been studying Angelman syndrome for a while, we've gotten some newer insights into this condition, and we now recognize that anxiety is seen in quite a number of patients with Angelman syndrome. Many suffer from constipation and other problems with GI motility. There's a subset of patients who seem to have abnormal food behaviors, like excessive interest in food and seeking food at night. And there are some patients that we know now on the very milder end of the spectrum that actually can speak in phrases. Ron Tiebert's group published an article on the changes that we see in adulthood for patients with Angelman syndrome. And the positive changes we see are usually seizures get less problematic, usually behavior problems get a little better, and usually behavior gets a little easier. Not everything is seen for every patient, of course, but the things that seem to get worse over time are anxiety and some movement disorders that are called non-epileptic myoclonus. And it also seems to be that mobility can get less good over time for some individuals. Constipation and troubles with gastroesophageal reflux disease seem to persist in adulthood. As any of you living with Angelman syndrome know, these changes translate into needing lifelong support. And that has a lot of impacts on patients, but not only on patients, on caregivers. So I'm sure you all are intimately aware with the impacts on your own physical health, mental health, social lives, and other things that come with caring for an individual with Angelman syndrome. Another group tried to measure this specifically by talking to caregivers and also to clinicians caring for individuals with Angelman syndrome. And you can see on here that speech, communication problems, and seizures are some of the things most often mentioned by individuals who were interviewed for this paper. So there are 4 molecular types of Angelman syndrome, and we're going to go into talking about these in detail, but in order to do that, I want to make sure that we're all starting on the same, with the same basic level of understanding. So I'm going to begin by giving you a little genetics lesson. So our bodies are made up, and Dr. Gomez is smiling because she's heard this about 1,000 times. Our bodies are made up of billions and billions of cells, and inside every cell in our body is genetic information. The genes are the instructions for how you build a human being, and they physically live on structures called chromosomes, and these little short, fat guys with stripes here are the chromosomes. Sorry about that background noise if any of you are hearing it. And there are specialists in the laboratory that identify which chromosomes are which and put them in order for the rest of us. And of course, it's the number 15 chromosome that we're interested in because that's where the Angelman gene resides. Now, a chromosome, which is shown here as a cartoon as this kind of blob, turns out to be just a very, very, very long piece of DNA that's packaged very tightly. And if we unwind it and uncouple it from all the proteins that it is associated with, it turns out to be this long piece of DNA. And a hunk of that DNA that is designed to do a specific thing or make a specific protein is called a gene. Now, normally, what a gene does is it makes a protein, and there are two steps to doing that. First, the gene must be transcribed into RNA, which is a messenger that then a complex machinery will then translate into protein. So we've got two complex machineries here, one that transcribes into RNA first, and then one that translates into protein. And once the protein is made, then it folds and assembles itself into doing what it, are you still seeing my screen? Okay, great, good. It changed for me, so I just wondered if it was okay for you. So once the protein is made, it spontaneously organizes and folds itself into a structure that does what it's supposed to be doing. And in this case, the UBE3A gene is an enzyme called a ligase. Okay, and what that ligase does is it attaches a ubiquitin molecule to other proteins to signal that they should be degraded. So in this cartoon here, ubiquitin is shown as these green blobs. There's three different enzymes, E1, E2, and E3, and they each have a role to play in getting ubiquitin organized so that it can be transferred onto a protein that is ready to be degraded, that needs to go to the recycling bin. So in this cartoon, the protein that needs to be degraded is this turquoise blob here. E3 attaches to that and associates with E2 to transfer the ubiquitin molecules from E2 onto the protein that needs to go to the recycling bin. So that will then trigger the protein to go to the recycling bin, where it will be broken down and the ubiquitin molecules can be recycled for use in something else. So that's our big guy there, E3. And the Angelman gene, UBE3A, is just one gene of many genes that make E3 ligases. Okay, so let's talk about, so what is it that happens in Angelman syndrome that doesn't allow the body to be able to make that protein? Well, in the normal situation, we get a chromosome 15 from our mom, which I've shown here in pink, and a chromosome 15 from our dad, which is shown in blue. And in all of us, in our brains, the paternal gene, the one coming from dad, is asleep. So it is not functional. It is perfectly healthy, but turned off. And that is the normal situation in all of our brains. And in the normal situation, we've got a gene, UBE3A gene, that lives right here on the chromosome that is active and is actively producing UBE3A protein. What happens in Angelman syndrome is that the gene, the UBE3A gene, is either missing or disabled in some way. And there are four ways for that to happen. The most common way is a deletion, where a hunk of mom's chromosome 15 is missing. So that's shown here by this piece that's gone. And of course, the UBE3A gene is part of that hunk that's missing. And so there's no gene there to be able to make any protein. The paternal gene's asleep, so we've got no protein being made in the brain. Another way to get UBE3A is for both of your chromosome 15s to come from dad. So in this situation, what usually happens is that in the egg that goes to make the individual, there is no chromosome 15 present from mom. And that would not be a survivable pregnancy unless the paternal chromosome got duplicated. So when that happens, you now have two copies of all your genes, but both UBE3A genes are silenced because that's the normal situation for the father's gene. Another way to get Angelman syndrome is shown over here on the right, where even though you got a chromosome from your mom,
as well as a chromosome from your dad. And your mom's chromosome is intact. It has everything there. There's no deletion. If you give your mom's chromosome the paternal imprint and turn it off by accident, that's called an imprinting defect. And that accounts for maybe 5 to 7% of Angelman syndrome, as does UPD. The deletion variety accounts for more like 70%. And then the last way to get Angelman syndrome is to have a mistake in a typo in the mom's copy of UBE3A. So in this variety, you got a copy from dad. The whole chromosome is there, but it's the UBE3A gene is asleep. You got a copy from mom. The whole chromosome is there. It's actually imprinted correctly, so the gene should be active, but it's disabled. It's got a typo in it. It can't make any functional protein. So these 3 varieties here we refer to as non-deletion, and they account for about 25–30% of Angelman syndrome, and the deletion variety accounts for the majority, 65 to 70%. So it's important to realize, and this is just the same information but displayed a little differently, it's important to realize that in every type of Angelman syndrome, there is at least one silenced or sleeping copy of UBE3A that could be activated or woken up if we had a mechanism to do that. So every type of Angelman syndrome could potentially respond to a therapy that would wake up the sleeping paternal gene. So how do we keep the paternal gene, or how might we do that? Well, we first have to understand how the paternal gene is kept asleep. And the way the paternal gene is kept asleep is by a long piece of RNA that comes from the opposite direction that the gene would normally be transcribed in. So what's shown here is the maternal chromosome. We've got our UBE3A gene here, and here is the direction of transcription. This is the direction that the RNA that's going to go make the protein would be normally made. The paternal gene doesn't make any protein, and the reason for that is that there's this long piece of RNA that comes from the other direction. That's called the antisense direction. So this is an antisense transcript or an antisense piece of RNA that is repressing the father's copy of the gene. And so what we need to do is to try to interrupt that guy and see if we can't get something that would remove that antisense transcript from repressing the paternal gene so that now the father's copy of the gene could do what the mother's copy is supposed to do. In other words, be transcribed and make a protein. So if we have this piece of RNA, this antisense transcript that we want to get rid of, how might we do that? Well, we can take advantage of a mechanism that we all have in every cell in our body. That mechanism is called the RNase H mechanism, and RNase H is an enzyme that will destroy whenever it sees a piece of RNA bound to a piece of DNA, because that's not supposed to happen in the normal situation, and it triggers RNase H to chop apart the RNA whenever it sees an RNA-DNA hybrid. And so if we make a little piece of artificial DNA called an antisense oligonucleotide that matches exactly this piece of RNA that we want to get rid of, we can trigger the RNase H mechanism to chop apart that RNA that we don't want, the antisense RNA. So how would that look? So in the top panel is shown what the situation is for an individual with Angelman syndrome. You've got your maternal gene that has a problem in it, not making any protein, and you have your paternal gene that is over here asleep because of the antisense transcript. So if we give an antisense oligonucleotide, we can now have that bind to our antisense transcript, get rid of it, and now you see the UBE3A gene from dad's chromosome can be transcribed, can be made into RNA and then into protein. So this is the idea that smart folks came up with, and Art Baudet, in collaboration with Ionis Pharmaceuticals, tried this strategy out to see if it might work. And they showed that indeed it does work in cells, nerve cells that you're growing in the dish in a laboratory. So you can take some cells, you can give them some chemicals to make them think or reprogram themselves into being nerve cells. And we can see that we can knock down the antisense transcript, which is this red line here. And that will upregulate the amount of protein, which is this blue line here. And so it was proven that we could do this in the laboratory in a dish. And then it was shown that we could do this in a mouse. And so if you take an Angelman mouse and you inject it with an antisense oligonucleotide, you can, if you inject that right into the ventricles, which are the fluid-filled cavities inside the brain, you can get it to be widely distributed throughout the brain, and you can get it to make Angelman protein, which is shown here by all this bright red signal. And importantly, after a single injection, the effect was sustained for up to 16 weeks. So this was very exciting and formed the basis of then some additional studies that were done to make sure that this compound seemed to act in a similar way in monkeys. There is no Angelman monkey as of yet. No monkey that naturally has Angelman syndrome or has been engineered to have Angelman syndrome. But we did do some studies in some healthy monkeys just to look at how the ASO was tolerated and how it was distributed, and it seemed to be promising. And so we went into the human. And there's where we're at now. There are 3 companies that have clinical trials going on of this exact strategy, the ASO strategy, to see if we can potentially come up with a treatment for Angelman syndrome. So these are phase 1/2 trials. In common disease, where you have lots and lots of patients that you can choose from to enroll in trials, usually phase 1 trials start off by testing your compound in a healthy individual to make sure that it is safe and tolerated. And then you would move on to phase 2 trials, where you would test the compound in individuals who have the condition you're wanting to study. In rare disease, these frequently are combined together because we have a limited population of individuals that we can enroll. And so all of these companies have phase 1/2 trials in progress. And each trial is a little different, but they all are designed to measure safety and tolerability primarily. So the Ultragenyx trial enrolls only patients with deletion from 4 to 17 years. The Roche trial enrolled both deletion and mutation patients. And they chose are full. They have completed their enrollment and now working on data and trying to get some
recording in progress.
Whether or not these ASOs can improve the lives of individuals with Angelman syndrome. So it's looking very promising that all of the ASOs have a good safety profile. So in the Ionis trial, they saw fever, vomiting, and cold symptoms in about 20% of the patients who received the ASO. In the Ultragenyx trial, they found leg weakness that was temporary. They saw it only at the highest doses, and they seem to have been able to solve that problem by reducing the amount and some other ways of administering the drug and giving a medication in advance that seem to have solved those problems. The Roche trial, I didn't get the hard data that I wanted in time for this presentation from Roche, but I did hear their presentation done at the Angelman Syndrome Foundation Scientific Symposium just a couple of weeks ago, and their data were very similar in terms of safety. And so we're going to talk about efficacy next. That's how well the drug works. These are some data that were shared by Ultragenyx. And I'd like to call your attention to the right panel first. A natural history study of Angelman syndrome has been going on for many, many years. And we have a lot of data collected over time that shows how individuals with Angelman syndrome change with respect to their skills over time. And so these Angelman natural history patients were evaluated with the Bailey third edition until the Bailey fourth edition came out. And now we have some patients who are being evaluated with the Bailey fourth edition. And we've got a few patients that have been evaluated a year apart with the Bailey. And so this shows what we would normally expect with cognition, in other words, learning, and with communication, and receptive communication was what Ultragenyx was looking at. So that's the ability to understand language. And so you can see that the amount of improvement or gain in skills is there, but it's very slow and gradual. On the left-hand panel, we're showing what was seen in some of the patients who were treated in the Ultragenyx study. So they had a variety of different cohorts that got different amounts of drug to start with and were gradually ramped up. And what this is showing is that the improvement that you see, and these scales are identical here, so they go from -3 to +18. And what you see is that the improvement is much increased over this very gradual improvement that we saw in the natural history of the condition. And so anything above this top dotted green line is felt to be a real clinical improvement. Same thing was seen with receptive communication. We got above this top green line here. So that was the Ultragenyx data, and they showed lots and lots of data. I'm not going to go through every slide that they had because that would take too long, but I just wanted to give you a sense of it with samples from what they showed us. These are from the Ionis trial. Similar results, but they displayed it a little differently. So here we've got expressive communication. These are the Ionis patients. These are our natural history controls. What we would have expected would be the change in natural history. Here is expressive communication. Bailey measures directly the individual's skills with a psychologist who's interacting directly with the patient. The Vineland is an interview that's done with families, asking them about the abilities of their angel. So both of these show a quite striking improvement over what we have seen in the natural history. The CGI, or clinical global impression of change, is a scale to measure whether we think somebody has gotten worse or improved or stayed the same, and whether it's a minimal change, a moderate change, or they're very much changed. And so this shows that we did show a change in individuals in the Ionis Halos trial that went in the direction of improvement. So this is a measure that is used by the investigator running the study, taking into account a lot of information about the individual with Angelman syndrome. So not just communication, but cognition, sleep, seizures, behavior, lots of different domains that are important to Angelman syndrome, but it is a clinician's opinion about how the patient is doing. And so the top part here was all looking at communication. The bottom part here is again looking at cognition, and you see that the results are very similar to what Ultragenic showed. We show improvement above what the natural history scale would have predicted, and improvements on the CGI as well. I didn't get any actual graphs from Roche in time to show you, but I can tell you that they presented their data, and it was all quite also in line with what has been seen with Ultragenics and Ionis. So it seems as though all three of these ASOs, which are different, they're chemically different, probably have different properties in terms of their side effect profile and maybe in terms of their efficacy, but all of them showed promise. So right now, we have supportive therapies that we use for children with Angelman syndrome. We do our best to treat their seizures and sleep and behavior problems. We do our best to manage their GI symptoms. But it's looking like in the future, it's very likely that we are going to have a different type of treatment that may actually change the underlying disorder, that we may change the underlying condition. And of course, we're only at the beginning of this journey with antisense oligonucleotides. There may be other strategies coming down the pike, gene therapy. You've probably heard of CRISPR-Cas9 as a way to go in and correct a typo in a gene. All of these things have potential, and I hope they ultimately also make it into the clinic. But for now, we seem to be poised to move from phase 1-2 trials into phase 3 trials. And in a phase 3 trial, what usually happens is that you have a group of patients with Angelman syndrome that you're going to randomize, and some of them will get real drug and some of them won't, for a period of time. And then usually what's happened is after that initial period of time where you've got your untreated and your treated groups, you then will move everybody into treatment. And that's the probable design that we're going to be looking at in phase 3 trials. We haven't seen those protocols yet, so this is just a presumption on my part based on what the FDA has done with other drugs, other indications, that we are probably looking at a placebo-controlled type of phase 3 trial. So with that, I'm going to stop. I wanted to give us plenty of time for questions because I'm sure you have some. And I wanted to let you know that, of course, Dr. Gomez is a native Portuguese speaker, so you can ask your questions in whatever language is comfortable for you.
Perguntas? Oi. Thank you, Dr. Bird. And I'll go on for questions.
A minha pergunta é sobre, assim, não tenho nenhuma familiaridade com o tema e com tratamentos genéticos, então é uma pergunta, acho que bem leiga, mas é sobre quais são as discussões em relação a questões éticas, assim, envolvidas nessa mudança genética, e o que isso representa em termos de que algumas condições deixem de existir, ou assim, não sei se dá para entender exatamente o que eu estou perguntando, mas quais são as questões éticas envolvidas?
Oi, vocês estão me ouvindo? A pergunta ficou um pouquinho difícil de entender, mas eu acho que você quer dizer o que esses dados que a doutora Bird apresentou significa em termos de o que você vê na criança de melhor, é isso que você perguntou?
Deixa eu perguntar aqui perto. Não, a pergunta... Tá me ouvindo, Adriana?
Agora eu estou te ouvindo, muito obrigada.
A pergunta é sobre as questões éticas envolvidas com tratamentos genéticos, né? Como eliminação de condições genéticas através de edição genética e isso tudo. Não necessariamente no caso de Angelman, mas...
Não necessariamente no caso de Angelman. Todos os tratamentos... tá bem. Todos os tratamentos são opcionais. Né? Ninguém tem a obrigação de fazer um tratamento. Então, se por algum motivo ético você não acredita que mexer no jeito que o gene veio para você, você não precisa usar nenhum tipo de tratamento. Eu acho que, partindo desse princípio, isso se torna mais fácil de lidar com as questões éticas.
Dr. Gomez, would you mind doing a tiny little translation for me of what...
Dr. Bird, she asked me what are the ethical problems of trying to change the way the genes came to us and how we feel about that. And my answer was all the treatments are optional. And no one needs to go through treatments that they don't believe are necessary.
Do you want to add to that, Dr. Bird?
Well, I don't think any of us know exactly what these treatments are going to bring for our loved ones with Angelman syndrome, but I don't think they will fundamentally change the personalities of individuals, but may make life just a little bit easier. But there are certainly families who are not going to be interested in these treatments, and that's absolutely fine. I don't think we are anywhere close to the point yet of knowing whether they are really going to change the trajectory of life for individuals with Angelman syndrome. But if they do, then there may be interest in treating them. There are some individuals with other conditions. We offer treatment to families, and some families say, yes, I would like my child to receive that treatment. And other families say, no, we're going to let nature take its course, and we're perfectly comfortable with that. So nobody needs to have treatment if they don't want it.
Perfect. Dr. Bird, do you mind stop sharing so we can see you both bigger?
Sure.
Perfect. Perguntas?
Tudo bem? Boa tarde. Eu só queria saber se nesses estudos vocês estão fazendo separados esses gráficos de evolução entre deleção, mutação e os outros mecanismos. Não tem dado o suficiente ou não é nem tratado diferente os estudos?
Carol, unfortunately, I need you to translate, yeah.
So the question is, if the data that you showed, the graphs, they separate between the genotypes or it's all together on the different trials?
It's the Ultragenics trial is only deletion patients, so there was nothing to separate there. The other two trials had small enough numbers that it wasn't really possible to separate out the deletion patients from the UBE3A mutation patients and have big enough numbers to say anything. So they are combined.
Os dados são combinados entre os genótipos, o teste da Ultragenics é só para deleção, então não tem separação nenhuma. Perguntas? Okay, does the size of the lesion makes any difference on the treatment?
As long as the deletion contains UBE3A, we would expect that replacing UBE3A would help with that particular gene loss. But in a deletion, there are other genes that are lost. And some of the studies have put a limit on the size of the deletion. So they aren't allowing patients to enroll who have deletions larger than 7 megabases. That's the basically the two different size deletions. The common one is smaller, and then there's a one that's a little bit larger, and then there are people who sometimes have bigger ones. And just in order to keep the patients as uniform as possible, some of the studies have mandated that only up to a certain size can be included. But there's no reason to think that a deletion of any size, if this treatment is shown to be beneficial, any size deletion could benefit.
Então, a resposta é que algumas das farmacêuticas limitaram o tamanho da deleção em 7 megabases para manter a amostragem de pacientes o mais uniforme possível, mas a Dr. Bird acredita que quem tem o UBE3A deletado vai se beneficiar igualmente da reposição do UBE3A, mais uma vez entendendo que a gente ainda não sabe exatamente o que os outros genes causam. I have a question. Would those, having those treatments approved, would we be able to combine different ASOs or different treatments to improve the outcomes?
I don't know the answer to your question. I think all of the ASOs are probably
Very similar.
going to basically result in the same thing, which is production of protein from dad's copy. But so I wouldn't expect that we would use, the Ionis ASO, also the Ultragenics, also the Roche in one patient. But it may be that a certain patient just happens to respond better to the Ultragenics than to the Ionis, or vice versa. And there may be a difference in side effects. So I think having more than one of these move forward is really important from a standpoint of treatment. But it's possible also that there are other treatments that are going to come down the line. And it's possible that we could use both an ASO and whatever that other treatment mechanism is. If they've got completely separate mechanisms, we can employ both of them.
Então, a minha pergunta foi se a gente poderia combinar tratamentos, né? Ela diz que pode ser que diferentes indivíduos respondam de forma diferente aos diferentes ASOs, mas que a gente tem outras linhas de tratamento que talvez possam ser combinadas com o ASO para ter uma melhora mais significativa. Pergunta aí.
Minha pergunta é sobre se o estudo ele acompanhou as evoluções a partir de um recorte de data, no sentido de mais velhos ou mais novos, teve algum tipo de evolução diferente entre si. E a outra pergunta é, a partir desse tratamento, eu estou entendendo que ele é um tratamento recorrente, né, ao longo do tempo. Como que funciona, o que acontece quando o tratamento, por algum motivo, é interrompido? Se tem algum benefício que fica, ou como que funciona esse retorno?
So the question is if the data collected is differentiated by age, younger patients, older patients, if you've seen improvement in all ages. And a segunda pergunta. If the treatment is stopped, do we see a regression? Are any of the benefits still there?
Questions. Ótimas perguntas.
So each of the studies enrolled a different age range, so it's hard to know how to answer your question exactly. For example, only the Iona study enrolled adult patients. Again, we have very small numbers, so there were only 50 patients enrolled, and some of them got the very lowest dose, so they were not really included in the analysis. The medium and high dose groups were then combined together to show you the data that I shared. So we don't have big enough numbers where we could sort of say, okay, how did the 3-year-olds do? How did the 6-year-olds do? How did the 12-year-olds do? Those data will come when we have bigger studies, but these very first studies are really just about safety. Their primary goal is to make sure that we're not harming patients, that the drugs are safe and well tolerated, and we just wanted to see if there was a hint of a signal of maybe improvement, and there does seem to be. But in terms of knowing how much improvement and what the right age to start treatment is, we're not there yet.
And regarding when you stop treatment, if you see any regression?
So again, we don't really have those data yet. Patients in the Ultragenics trial who had the leg weakness, and then the trial got stopped for a period of time and then was resumed. The anecdotes I heard were that, yes, there were some changes. I don't know if anybody lost new skills they learned, like words or the ability to walk or swim. But we certainly saw some changes in sleep and behavior that suggested the drug had worn off. So it does seem like there is a period of time when the drug is active, and then the body is probably breaking it down like we do all drugs. And so it is the kind of drug that's going to need to be given regularly. But those patients who stopped for a period of time in the Ultragenic study did seem to show that some of the benefits they had gotten went away. I don't have the details to know if everything went away or if they retained some things, but we should, those data will come as we get further along down this path of drug development.
Alessandra, você quer fazer a sua pergunta? Porque ela só escuta se eu ficar perto da câmera. E aí você faz daí, ou se você quiser, vem aqui fazer aqui perto da câmera. Então fala.
Uma das perguntas é se existe no mundo alguma pesquisa que eu sei que lá não é, que inclui os indivíduos com disfonia uniparental.
Are there any trials including UPD patients?
Not yet, but it is on everybody's radar. The reason why the companies all started with deletion and mutation patients is that those patients have only one copy of the gene to wake up. So they wanted to start with a population that they could see if we're going to get some protein produced, and we didn't want to overdo it because too much UBE3A is also felt to be harmful. We've got patients who have duplications of the same region that's deleted in Angelman syndrome, and those patients also have seizures intellectual disability and many times autism and poor communication.
Então, ainda não.
We think that there's a sweet spot.
We couldn't hear
Did you want to translate, Carol? Or?
Yeah, I couldn't hear the last part, so I'll translate the first part and then you can move on. Ela disse que ainda não tem tratamento para UPD, porque as farmacêuticas preferiram começar com os pacientes de deleção e mutação, porque eles só têm uma cópia que pode ser ativada, né, que é a cópia paterna, para ver como ia ser a expressão do BE3A, porque é conhecido que uma duplicação do BE3A, uma superexpressão de BE3A, causa epilepsia, deficiência intelectual, e como os pacientes com ICD e UPD têm duas cópias que podem ser ativadas, pode causar uma superexpressão e dar resultados negativos, porque você está tendo muito BE3A também.
E só a última pergunta, esses estudos, qual que é o foco na melhora de vida? Qual está sendo o foco?
So the second question is, what are the outcomes being focused on these trials to, is it communication, behavior? What are the main focus of outcomes to approve these medications?
So the phase 1-2 trials, the primary outcome is safety. But they did look at some exploratory outcomes to see if the drugs seemed to have any benefit. And all of those things were looked at. So communication, cognition, behavior, sleep, seizures. So all of those things were assessed in some way with a variety of different tools, the Bailey, the Vineland, the investigator opinion, the CGI. So they all were looked at. Which one of those outcomes is going to be chosen as the primary endpoint for the phase 3 studies is still under discussion. And different companies may come up with different ideas about what they want to measure. One company may decide they're going to put cognition as their primary outcome, and another company may decide we're going to put expressive communication as our primary outcome. The primary outcome is really important because if you don't achieve your showing a statistically significant difference in your primary outcome, it is very difficult to get the FDA to approve a drug that doesn't meet its primary outcome. So it's a big decision to make what you're going to hang all of your hope on. So these companies are being very thoughtful, speaking to lots and lots of opinion leaders in our field to get input on what the best outcome measure is.
And that's going to be measured on phase 3, right?
Yes.
Ok. Então, eles avaliam, nas fases 1 e 2, eles avaliam sono, epilepsia, comportamento, comunicação, tudo, né?
O foco se é safe.
Mas a fase 1 e 2, o foco é a segurança da medicação. E a partir dos dados preliminares de fase 1 e 2, eles têm que dizer, para a fase 3, qual é o objetivo principal da medicação. Porque se a medicação na fase 3 não atinge o objetivo principal, ela não é aprovada pela FDA. Então, eles avaliam os dados de fase 1 e 2, primeiro segurança e depois os dados preliminares de comunicação, comportamento, sono, epilepsia, parte motora. E eles veem, por exemplo, uma medicação tem uma melhora maior na comunicação. E aí eles escolhem esse como objetivo principal da medicação, e aí é isso que vai ser avaliado em fase 3. E é nesse momento que a gente está agora com tanto o teste da Ultragenyx quanto da Ionis. Né? Esse desenho da fase 3. O que vai ser mensurado na fase 3 para que a medicação seja aprovada.
E ainda não foi decidido por nenhuma companhia qual vai ser o objetivo principal. none of the companies have the outcome selected yet.
Mais perguntas? Eu acho que a gente já está entrando no final aqui, acho que é a última pergunta, para a gente poder... So the last question is, what is the estimate of time for phase 3 approval and to make it available commercially? And do you have any estimates of cost?
No on the last question. No idea. So with luck, phase 3 trials will begin enrolling in early 2025. And they will probably be at least a year of treatment. And then patients who got placebo would be switched over to real drug. So we would be looking at, I would think, late 2026 for the first readout from what the results were in the treatment versus placebo groups to take a look at the difference. And then if things look good, then you go back to the FDA and you talk some more. And if the FDA really likes your data, they tell you, yes, put together your package and submit it to us. And you know, there's a bunch of paperwork because it's a big bureaucracy. So could there be medication available by 2027? Maybe?
Então, a fase 3 deve começar, né, no melhor cenário, no início do ano que vem, pelo menos 1 ano de duplo cego, né? Então, alguns pacientes recebendo a medicação, alguns pacientes recebendo um placebo. Depois, os pacientes do placebo entram com a medicação. Elas acreditam que aí, se começar no início de 2025, no final de 2026, a gente deve ter os resultados dessa terceira fase, que aí são, então, submetidas para a FDA. A FDA, então, espera um pacote para aprovar. Ela acredita que, se tudo andar no prazo mais curto, 2027.
E sem previsão de custo.
Sem previsão de custo. Sem previsão. Última pergunta, gente, porque elas realmente precisam ir. Fala, porque eu tenho que falar lá no...
That's a question.
Ela respondeu. Não.
Se depois que você for aprovado, se depois vai ser mais fácil, mais rápido de ter resultado para a
Would UPD be included after the results for deletion and mutation? Would that speed up the process for UPD? What are your thoughts?
I suspect, and I don't know this because I don't have any special insight, but I suspect for the phase 3 trial, it's going to be, again, just deletion and mutation patients. But at the same time, while that trial is going on, I expect there to be phase 1-2 trials for UPD and imprinting patients. So looking again at safety, making sure that we've got a safe dose, that we are not overdosing patients. And it looks like it's got a good safety profile. So I'm optimistic that we will find a dose that's good for those with UPD and imprinting defects also.
Então, ela suspeita, né? Ela não tem nenhuma informação concreta de que fase 3 será ainda deleção e mutação, mas ela acredita que é possível que as farmacêuticas, então, comecem fase 1 e 2 para ICD e UPD, em paralelo à fase 3 para deleção e mutação. E daí mais alguns anos até aprovar para UPD e ICD. Não, eu não posso, realmente, Tânia, infelizmente, porque a gente precisa entregar.
Carol, se você quiser, eu fico mais um pouco. A gente pode deixar a Dr. Birdie.
So,
Dr. Birdie.
can you? We have one last question. If you want to go, Dr. Bird, Dr. Gomez can answer, or if you want to stay. I don't want to take one. And we have to be on schedule because we do have other talks. Tânia, fala. So, a pergunta, vou fazer para você, Adriana, e eu falo em inglês também para a Dr. Bird. Ela tem um filho de 34 anos, no melhor cenário, por volta dos 40, tem uma medicação aprovada, tem resultado para ele. So, she has a 34-year-old, best scenario, by 40, there will be an approved medication. Will there be good outcomes for an adult Angelman syndrome patient?
The only trial that enrolled adults was the Ionis Halos trial. And, that trial included 50 patients total. And only a handful of them were adults, maybe 10. But when we put their information together with all the other patients, those data were shown to you. So it looks to me like there is benefit that can be achieved at any age. But we don't have big enough numbers to say that with great confidence at this point. Okay. But I'm optimistic.
Ok. Então, o único teste clínico que incluiu adultos foi o da Ionis, com uma amostragem de 50 pacientes, e desses 50, no máximo 10 são adultos. Os dados desses adultos foram incluídos nesses gráficos que você viu, então ela é muito otimista de que sim, vai haver melhora para os adultos também. Tá? E só para você saber, o teste clínico da Ionis foi até 50 anos de idade. Então, passa da idade do Felipe. Thank you so much, Dr. Bird. Once again.
And Dr. Gomez, please, Carol, tell your audience that if they have additional questions, we'd be happy to answer them through email.
Perfect.
Se vocês tiverem qualquer pergunta, podem escrever para a gente. Eu traduzo para a Dr. Bird e respondo para vocês. Carol, você pode dividir meu e-mail com eles e eu vou fazer questão de responder todos vocês.
Muito obrigado, Adriana. Thank you so much, Dr. Bird.
Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you. And you have a good day for both of you. Obrigado, Adriana. Maravilhosas como sempre.
Muito obrigada a vocês. Essas perguntas foram maravilhosas. Muito obrigada a todos vocês por participarem. As perguntas foram exatamente o que a gente gosta de escutar. Quando as pessoas estão prestando atenção, eu estou muito orgulhosa de todos vocês. E que vocês precisarem, escrevam aí para a gente. O que eu puder, eu estou aqui para ajudar. Carol, muito, muito, muito legal ver vocês por aí. Um beijo, um bom dia.
A gente se vê daqui a 2 semanas.
Tchau.